then and so, as you just heard, we are going to record this evening's meeting. Um, and so, if you'd rather not ask your question verbally or be on camera, you're welcome to drop your questions in the chat when that time comes. So if you're looking for your camera or your mute and unmute buttons, they're just in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And if you at any point want to change the view that you're seeing this event in, you can change that in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And closed captions are available for this evening's event, so you can turn those on in the bottom bar of your screen. There should be a closed caption subtitle view subtitle or hide subtitle button that you can click on the bottom bar of your screen. And very excited to announce that we are also streaming this talk live on Twitch, courtesy of Boston Court's board member Greg Chun. And so hello and welcome to everyone that's watching us on Twitch as well. We're really excited to be venturing out into the Twitch universe. So without further ado, I think I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael, to get going. Thank you all so much.
Yay, thank you, Margaret. So I'm always excited to talk about Stephen Sondheim. As Margaret said, there's a sort of dual purpose for tonight. First is to honor Sondheim on what would have been his 92nd birthday. As you probably all know, he died last fall, the day after Thanksgiving, having reportedly had a beautiful Thanksgiving day with loved ones. And I guess that's the way to go. But it obviously has left a big hole in the American musical theater and in those of us who have always loved his work. But we're also here to just celebrate his work, as Josh will be doing this weekend with his combo. It's a 4-piece combo, including Josh on the piano and 3 vocalists. And it's very exciting. I am in New York now, and so sorry that I can't be there to experience it, but it sounds like it's going to be a spectacular evening. So tonight I'm going to talk about Sondheim, not in a scholarly sort of approach, because there are many who probably are much more capable than I of that. I'm going to talk about his work as a lifelong fan of his work, as someone who sort of graduated from fan to student to interpreter as I began directing his work. And it's also tricky because there may be some of you who are watching who know as much or more than I do, and others who know very little. So I'm not going to assume anything, but please, if you've got questions, if I skip over things that I assume you know and you want to talk about it at the end, please be prepared to ask those questions. Briefly, before I start talking about my connection with him, Stephen Sondheim wrote 18 musical scores for musical theater that were produced on Broadway or off Broadway. 15 of them he wrote music and lyrics. 3 of them he wrote lyrics only to someone else's music. That does not count the reviews, the concerts, the tributes, or shows that he wrote additional or incidental music, or where he made minor contributions, and it doesn't include his work for film and television projects. In his lifetime, he received 8 Tony Awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Award, 8 Grammy Awards, an Academy Award, a Pulitzer Prize, an Olivier Award, and a Presidential Medal of Freedom. He was born in 1930 in New York City, and his parents divorced when he was 10 years old, and his mother moved him to Doylestown, Pennsylvania, which turned out to be fortuitous because, as Sondheim said, he was not fond of his mother, but he said that she was always essentially seeking important people to be around her. And among the important people were the Hammersteins. Jamie Hammerstein became a friend of Steve's when he was a small kid, and Jamie's father happened to be Oscar Hammerstein of Rodgers and Hammerstein fame. And Oscar became Steve's mentor and a sort of father figure for him. And Steve acknowledges that most of what he learned about musical theater, he learned through Oscar, which is interesting when you see how that affected his work following that. His first show was West Side Story on Broadway, which was in 1957 with lyrics by Stephen Sondheim and music by Leonard Bernstein. I assume all of you are familiar with West Side Story, so I don't need to go into that. But West Side Story opened the year before I was born. So he has literally always been around in my life because my parents had that cast album. And from the time I assume I was a little kid, that was played in my household. So the scores of Stephen Sondheim were the soundtrack of my youth. And I was exposed to the shows West Side Story, Gypsy, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, and Company, all during my childhood. Listened to those albums in the background just as you would listen to popular music now. And so they were always around. I saw touring productions and some local productions of a lot of those shows. And I played the albums incessantly. And then just as I hit my teenage years, when I turned 13, there was a show that Sondheim wrote called Follies. And I remember my mother got that album and I was fascinated by this show. And it's, as a 13-year-old boy living in the boonies outside of San Diego, I don't know why a show about disillusionment and missed opportunities and midlife crises and the crumbling of dreams was so compelling to me, but something about it just fascinated me. And I'm sure that it was a combination of a kind of urban sophistication that was unfamiliar but fascinating. There's a lot of showbiz dazzle in that show. And there's a lot of mournful longing that even as a 13-year-old, there was something about that I found intriguing. So at that point, I began to form an idea about who Stephen Sondheim was and what it was he was contributing to this art form. And I was so curious. Then at the age of 15, my mother brought my brother and I to our first trip to New York City. And it was fortuitous that the first Broadway show that I saw was A Little Night Music. And I was knocked out by it. It was not like the traditional musical comedies that I had been exposed to through most of my lifetime. It was smart, it was sophisticated, it was witty, it was full of complexities and ambiguities. And the score was really tuneful and musically satisfying and pleasing, but it was more than just a string of show tunes. There was something about it. Even my young, unsophisticated brain knew that there was something musically happening that I didn't often see happening in musical theater. And I was so fascinated by that. So that show was a real turning point for me. I knew that that kind of musical theater was something that fascinated me in a world that I wanted to live in. So from that point on, I was no longer in the passenger seat. I was in the driver's seat. When a new Sondheim show came out, I was the one who ran out and grabbed the cast album to it. I sought productions of his shows. I began collecting stuff, including recordings and scripts and programs and books and posters and all sorts of memorabilia. And I really sought out his work. And that also began what was a lifetime of collecting Sondheim memorabilia. If I were in my Los Angeles home right now, I could share some of this with you, but I have a room that is largely devoted to this memorabilia, including binders full of things and boxes and tons of albums and recordings and bootlegs and scripts and scores and all sorts of wonderful things that I've collected but pored over and studied throughout my life. And it began as a sort of childhood curiosity and obsession, and I am a little embarrassed, but say with some pride that I've never quite outgrown that obsession. And I am delighted to have those things that I love and mean so much to me around me all the time. And so it was during this period that I became more than a fan of his work. I really became a student. And in the same way that Sondheim describes Oscar as having been a mentor without having any direct communication with Sondheim at that point, I studied his works and read about them so much because I wanted to learn how he did what he did. And it became the basis of my training about theater in general, but especially musical theater, and musical theater as I held up as the sort of ideal of what musical theater could be. I came to understand that he occupied a unique place in the American musical theater. He had learned from Oscar Hammerstein, who is considered one of the greats of the golden age of musical theater, where the sort of traditional musical theater was formed. And just to say, Oscar Hammerstein was also a mold breaker. He came out of a tradition where things were either growing from the traditions of operetta, which usually was sort of foolish stories and very lighthearted and all about let's get to the next song, or thinly veiled musical reviews in which songs that could have appeared in any show were given some kind of a book to sort of string them together. Oscar Hammerstein was one of the people who said, wait a minute, we could elevate this form. And through his work with Richard Rodgers, and even before that, for instance, with Jerome Kern on Showboat, he began to say, how can we deepen this storytelling and integrate music and lyrics and book and staging and choreography to tell stories that were more meaningful. And so this was the tradition that Stephen Sondheim grew out of. But standing on the shoulders of all these greats who he studied deeply and respected tremendously, he began to employ a kind of craft and intellectual rigor to musicals that previously had mostly in the theater been reserved for straight plays, for non-musical plays. And he said, wait a minute, we can apply the same craft and rigor and intelligence to musical theater that we do to some straight plays. So Sondheim was uncompromising. He was demanding of his collaborators and even more of himself. And he was a Broadway baby. He had grown up going to theater his whole life. He knew that it was important to connect to his audience, but he wanted it to resonate with them. But he also refused to pander to his audience, and he demanded as much from them as he did from himself and his collaborators. He wasn't going to make it easy. He wanted to challenge people, even in the audience who were watching things, which was, again, very unusual for musical theater. Not unheard of, but unusual. So in an art form that previously had often valued things like simplicity and familiarity and sentiment, he valued things like complexity and innovation and intellect and things that were very different values than what was the traditional musical theater fare. At that time, most musical theater was called musical comedy because there was very little musical drama up to that point. And so he was playing with the form. He was trying new things. And anytime you try new things, it's interesting with a work of art. If you're a painter and you're trying a new form and your painting doesn't resonate with an audience at the time, you may have trouble selling your paintings, but the painting still lives on. And some generations later, people can look at it and say, oh, now I get what he was doing then. The thing with musical theater, or with any kind of theater, is it lives in the moment. Of course, of course, you can always revive a production or do a new production of something, but that production happened while that audience was sitting in that theater and until that production closed. And if people were not ready to receive it at that time, then it was considered a failure, a flop, in either creatively or very often financially. And so that was true of a lot of Sondheim's shows, particularly his early ones. People didn't know what to make of it. Audiences didn't know what to make of it. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Shows that at the time were given critical reviews, sometimes scathing and dismissive reviews, have since then been revived, and the same show with the same book score lyrics has been praised for its writing. And that's not that the show changed. I mean, the production may have changed, but what really changed was the times and the audience. And so that's one of the things about innovation in the theater or in any art form that exists in time, which performing arts does. So that was true of a lot of his shows. Many of his shows were not successes in their first productions. And in fact, he was often dismissed because his first two Broadway shows were West Side Story and Gypsy, for which he wrote only the lyrics. Other people wrote the music. And his lyrics were very clever and smart and witty, and he was often acknowledged for that. But people then began to say, oh yeah, Stephen Sondheim, he's the one who's the great lyricist. His music isn't so good, but his lyrics are really great. And that was a criticism for much of his career. Well, in fact, Sondheim was a very accomplished accomplished musician. He studied music with a man named Milton Babbitt, who was a brilliant sort of avant-garde composer and teacher. Also had an interest in the theater, so that was great. They would study the works of all of the great musical theater writers. They would spend long sessions delving into the work of Jerome Kern and understanding how he accomplished what he did, so that they could learn from that and learn how Sondheim could translate those same ideas. So he was a very accomplished musician, and that was the thing that, between music and lyrics, it was the thing that he felt more confident in and actually enjoyed doing more than lyrics. Lyrics were tedious for him. It was challenging. Music was the thing that sort of turned him on. So particularly in his early years, people kind of dismissed the music very often. So things began to change at some point in his career as people began to realize the place he held in the American musical theater, and that started turning around. But it never changed that he was continuing to explore new things and innovate. And every time you thought you knew who he was and what he was up to, he was trying something new. He was off on some new idea. I feel very confident that his work will stand the test of time, that most of those 18 shows that he wrote the scores for will continue to be produced for many years, probably decades, probably centuries. We will look back, like we do with the work of William Shakespeare, at him as someone who wrote great classics, and people will be eager to go back in and delve in again and discover his brilliance on things. He was, I think, a Shakespeare for our age. So I've seen productions of every Sondheim musical. In most cases, many productions. I've traveled all over the country and in some cases over the world to seek them out. And while there are some of his shows that I have loved and resonated with than others, there are some that don't connect with me as deeply, although I appreciate them all. But there are a few that have really been standouts. And for me, one of them was, I think, the singular most profound experience I have ever had in the theater as an audience member was seeing the original production of Sunday in the Park with George. And the conventional wisdom about Sunday in the Park with George is that the first act is great, but the second act is problematic. And I'd heard all that buzz. And I think some of that buzz was created because the show went into performances, into previews on Broadway incomplete. Literally, there were huge chunks of the second act missing. Um, Move On was not written until the last minute. Lesson number 8 wasn't written until very late. I mean, there were things that were coming in literally days before the critics were coming. So people in preview audiences were seeing a show that was incomplete. And of course, there is a theater buzz that starts happening, and people want to know the narrative. Is this show good? Should I go see it? Well, so-and-so said it was great, whatever. So the buzz was, oh, this show is a hot mess. The first act is beautiful, but that second act. So I'd heard all of that when I went in to see the show. And my experience was, I thought the first act was beautiful. I loved it. And I was unprepared for the second act. I found it smart and moving and beautiful. By the time it got to the song Children in Art, I became very emotional, and something was happening to me that I didn't quite know how to explain. And then during the song Lesson Number 8, I began crying. And during the song Move On, I started weeping so uncontrollably. I literally was thinking they're going to have to take me out of the theater because I am making such a scene, or I am going to, I didn't know what was happening to me. Something began to move me so deeply. And I've seen many productions since then. I've studied the book and score. I'm not sure I can fully articulate why it had such an incredible impact on me. I will say that there are things about the process of making art. The show Sunday in the Park with George is about the life of the painter George Seurat and his creative process. And the second act is about someone who may or may not be a descendant of George Seurat, who is having a creative crisis. And there is something about the articulation of the creative process and what it means to be an artist, and how you struggle to create, and how moving it is when you are able to create, that I just feel that they tapped into so deeply that it really hit a vein for me. So for me, that stands out as a really great moment in a lifetime of theater going in general, and certainly of Sondheim shows. James Lapine, who wrote the book for Sunday in the Park with George and who also directed the show, wrote a wonderful book that came out this last year called Putting It Together, How Stephen Sondheim and I Wrote Sunday in the Park with George. It's a fantastic story if you are interested in that show, in Sondheim's work, in the creative process. What's fascinating about the book is that it tells, with all of the warts and everything, about the very challenging and problematic process of getting what became a Pulitzer Prize winning masterpiece, how getting it to its final form in a way that, as I read the book, it was harrowing. It was like watching, for me as a creative person who has gone through that process, it was like, like watching a thriller movie in terms of, I know it's all going to work out okay in the end, but it was kind of terrifying. It was quite a high wire act. So those are some of my experiences in studying and being a fan of his work. But it was as an interpreter of his work, by directing some of his productions, that I grew to appreciate his work even more deeply. Through the years, I've been lucky to direct a lot of Sondheim musicals. I've done productions of The Frogs and Putting It Together, which is a review of some of his songs. I did concert versions of Saturday Night, which was a show that was supposed to have been his first Broadway show, except that the producer died before they could get it produced. So it was not ever produced until many years later, when it was done in London and then again off Broadway. So I did concert versions of those shows. I directed a production of one of his most famous flops, a show called Anyone Can Whistle. Anyone Can Whistle was a very unique show. It happened after his the first Broadway show for which he wrote both music and lyrics was A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. And the show was praised and successful in many ways, but in a lot of ways, Sondheim's work was ignored. There are literally reviews to that show in major New York papers that don't mention the composer's name, the composer lyricist's name. He was not mentioned in some of the reviews. He was that overlooked. And those who did speak about his work, some of them were mildly praising and some of them were sort of dismissive. So he decided he was going to do something that was going to be out there and ballsy and announce to the world who he was. And well, he did that. He and Arthur Lawrence wrote the wackiest musical, so wacky that it played a total of 9 performances before it closed. It's a famous flop. It's an unusual story anyway. It's also an unusual structure. It's a 3-act musical. And that was very unusual, certainly at that time, unheard of now. So I did a revival of this show a number of years ago, and I did a revision of the book that I didn't write any new book at all, but I restructured and edited and moved things around, and we submitted it to Sondheim and Arthur Lawrence for permission to do this version. We got their permission to do so, and we produced a 2-act version of Anyone Can Whistle. Arthur Lawrence was apparently pleased enough with it that he went on to revise the show, doing some updates of the period and that kind of thing, but he essentially used my structure for the show in his future productions. So that was fascinating to be that inside of it, that I was literally reforming a show that by almost all accounts was not a successful show, and I think they were eager to try to find a way to make it work better. Let me look at this. Yeah, so I also did a production of what many, including myself, consider one of his great masterpieces, which is Sweeney Todd. It's a remarkably crafted show with an incredible score and book. I did it starring my dear friends George Ball and Amanda McBroom, and it was a real pleasure to work on that show. And then there is a little show, the last Broadway musical that Sondheim wrote, called Passion, which we were doing a production of at Boston Court in March of 2020. We had gone through a weekend of previews and had gone back to do, as we usually do there, a couple of days of rehearsals before we were heading into our opening weekend. And 2 days before our official opening, this little thing called COVID-19 came around, and we had to close the show before getting to open it. And unfortunately, there's not been an opportunity yet to bring that one back. But I will say that working on that show, getting to know it as deeply and intimately as I did, and working with the extraordinary artists on and off the stage there, gave me such a tremendous appreciation for that work as well. Because Sondheim wrote for the stage, it was bringing his works to life that gave me the greater appreciation for them. And anyone who has worked on plays or musicals for the stage knows that there are ones that you get that are you sort of don't dare scratch the surface too much, because if you do, you realize that it's painted tin, and that there's not much beneath it. But when you're working on shows like Sweeney Todd or Passion, you're eager to scratch the surface and dig as deep as you like, because what's underneath is gold. Every decision about every character, every plot point, every note, every lyric was made with intention and clarity. And they may not always have been the choices that you would make, but they are made with such integrity and thoughtfulness that there are huge rewards for the artists who dig deep on those things. So working on his shows gave me an even greater appreciation than I had as a fan, as an audience, as a student of his work. Being a practitioner, bringing his works to life has given me such great respect for what he has done. Sondheim's first Broadway show, West Side Story, opened on Broadway in 1957. And his last full score for the theater, which was a show called Roadshow, opened off Broadway in 2008, which was 51 years later. So he had a span of 51 years where he was writing scores for the theater. In the 13 years since Roadshow opened, he continued to write. He has written quite a bit of new material for a number of different things. There was discussion about a new musical he was writing with David Ives as recently as last fall. Last year, I commissioned a dear friend of mine, Travis Michael Holder, to paint a painting of Sondheim. And when I asked him to paint it, I asked him to include a quote on the painting itself from Sunday in the Park with George. And that quote is, "Anything you do, let it come from you, then it will be new. Give us more to see." And Sondheim has said that one of the things that keeps him from writing is his awareness of the kind of expectation that people have on him. That once he realized that people were deifying him, it became crippling because he was afraid he couldn't live up to what people expected. And it meant that his output was less because he feared not being able to rise to their expectations. And I told Travis that including that quote felt to me like a sort of invocation or a prayer that Sondheim would somehow unburden himself from that pressure and make something new, even at this late stage in his life and his career. But even as I asked that of Travis, I knew that it was unlikely he was going to give us another work. There had been discussion of this new musical he was working on. They did a reading last fall of it, and there was discussion that it was happening, but he'd really only written the first act. There was much more to do. Sondheim always admitted that he is a procrastinator, that he works under deadlines. And the best deadlines are when you have a production and someone's saying, "Damn it, write this song. We have an opening," or whatever. And nobody was giving him that kind of pressure. They were not, he was not in great health. Nobody was putting that kind of pressure on him. So I thought it was extremely unlikely that he was going to finish that score and we were going to see anything else from him. And indeed, last fall, we got to the end of his life. But the beautiful thing is the legacy that he has left us in terms of these remarkable shows, which, as I've already said, I know are going to be produced for many, many years. I mean, already there are so many in celebration of Sondheim's life and career. There are so many performances of shows and concerts and tributes and things that are happening. One of the things that's interesting, aside from the production of his shows, people perform Sondheim's songs a lot out of the context of those shows. But in many ways, they're difficult to do outside of the context because he wrote lyrics that were so specific to the characters and the plots and the situations of those shows, unlike the musical theater greats of previous eras, and even many during the time he was writing. There were very few songs that he wrote that could be lifted from the context of the shows and still really make sense. So while people do his songs all the time in cabarets and in auditions, and there are tons of albums where people are doing his material, a lot of the material sort of requires an understanding of the context in order to really fully appreciate what he's doing. Now, there are some exceptions to that. A lot of people jokingly have said that there should be an album called Stephen Sondheim's Greatest Hit, which is just all the recordings of Send in the Clowns, because that is the one sort of breakthrough song that he had that has had general universal success, not because of the original production of A Little Night Music that it came from, but because of the recordings that Frank Sinatra and Judy Collins did that brought it to popularity. Um, there are artists who continue reinventing his work and making it work for a new age and a new audience. I recommend for those of you who want to hear his work in a fresh and interesting way, there's a album that came out last year by a woman named Larry Ward called A Perfect Little Death. And she is a sort of indie folk performer, and she performs his songs with just her voice and guitar. And they are fascinating reinventions of the songs. These songs that I know by heart and could sing along with them, I feel like I am hearing them in brand new ways, and it's very exciting to hear them sort of reinvented. And another way that they are reinvented is through instrumental versions of them. And this is one of the things I find fascinating for those who feel like his work, uh, he excelled as a lyricist and not so much as a musician. That is belied by the number of musical people who continue recording instrumental versions of his material. There are tons of jazz recordings of his music, of instrumental recordings. There's a fantastic recording called Symphonic Sondheim, where Don Sebesky conducted the London Symphony Orchestra. And they are new arrangements that he created for symphony orchestra. They're just extraordinary. Margaret was playing as we came in some selections from an album called Color and Light, Jazz Sketches on Sondheim, which includes a bunch of fantastic jazz musicians, including Herbie Hancock and Nancy Wilson and Peeble Bryson and a bunch of others. It's a fantastic album. And this weekend at Boston Court, we have the wonderful Josh Nelson, who's going to be doing a bunch of his songs. And to hear them reinvented, some with vocalists and some as instrumental versions, I'm sure is going to be very exciting. He is doing songs from a number of different shows. I just want to talk to you a little bit about what those shows are before we open this up for questions. He's doing one song from West Side Story, the song Somewhere, for which Sondheim wrote only lyrics. He's doing a song from Company, which is a fairly popular musical. There's a production happening right now on Broadway that is gender swapping the title character of Bobby as a woman and is very exciting. He's doing one song from Follies, one song from a beautiful show called Pacific Overtures, which is in a very unlikely way the story in the 19th century of Japan's opening up to trade with the West. The most unlikely idea for a musical, and a just extraordinarily beautiful musical. He's doing a song from a show called Evening Primrose, which was a television musical that he wrote based on a short story. It's a sort of weird little one-act horror musical about a poet who hides out in a department store and then discovers that it is populated with people who pretend to be mannequins during the day and come to life at night. And so he's doing a song from that. He's doing a song from the movie Dick Tracy, for which he wrote several songs, including one for which he wrote one song won an Academy Award. He's doing two songs from the masterwork that I told you about, Sweeney Todd, one of my favorites and just a glorious score. He's doing three songs from a show I haven't mentioned yet, but Into the Woods. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with that because it's been produced very often, was made into a film. It's a beautiful reinvention of the Grimm fairy tales that weaves them all together and tells a story about parents and children and the things we wish for. And then he's doing four songs from the show that I told you, Changed My Life, Sunday in the Park with George, which it is not surprising to me that as a musician, he is drawn so much to these songs, which are so musically rich and so full of the, as I said, full of the process of the creative process. So in conclusion, I am very grateful for a lifetime of learning and pleasure that I've gotten from Stephen Sondheim, and I'm very excited for what I know will be many more experiences of that in the future. And with that, I would love it to open it up to any questions or thoughts any of you have.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to just raise your hand or drop it in the chat, and we'll call on you and you can ask Michael your
Or
question.
share experiences you have had as well, since much of this has been about me sharing my experiences.
Jane Crane, go ahead and unmute. You're still muted, I think. There you go.
Hi. Yeah, my name is Steve. Jane and I are married. Anyhow, it's a stupid question, but I'll throw it out anyhow.
Oh, please, those are good questions.
How did he get chosen to write the lyrics for West Side Story?
That happened from Arthur Lawrence, who was the book writer, who was a friend of his, and he was not the first choice. They had gone to a number of different people. He didn't want to write just lyrics, but Oscar Hammerstein encouraged him to do so because he thought it would be very good for him. He had to audition for the job. There's actually a beautiful story. Leonard Bernstein was originally credited as a co-lyricist, and many of the lyrics that are still in the show were written by Leonard Bernstein. And he, in its out-of-town tryout, Leonard was still credited as being a co-lyricist. And Sondheim told a story, I may get some of these details slightly wrong, but the gist is correct, that he was sort of in a funk because he realized that, of course, nobody was acknowledging this nobody lyricist that nobody knew, and everyone was praising the music of the already acknowledged genius of Leonard Bernstein. And Bernstein recognized that this was the case and said to him, I want to take my name off the credits. I want you to take the sole credit for it. And Sondheim was, of course, very grateful. And Leonard Bernstein said, and I'll give you all my percentage points for it. And Sondheim foolishly said, oh, no, I'll still share those with you. And he said he had the regret that he had not taken him up on that offer, because it would have made him a lot more money. But that is an example of the generosity that Leonard Bernstein had, and the acknowledgement of how meaningful it would be to a young person at that stage of his career.
Now, why did they, I mean, Bernstein was capable of writing his own lyrics, was he not?
Yeah,
so why did he have somebody else write the lyrics?
He had written some lyrics, but he also worked with many other lyricists in other projects, so it was not unusual for him to work with other lyricists. I do think what's interesting is there are lyrics in the show that Sondheim is a little embarrassed about that were obviously Bernstein's lyrics, and you can kind of tell that they are. It's a different voice than Sondheim's voice. Many of the lyrics to the song Tonight, which is obviously a beautiful song, and I love it dearly, but Tonight There Will Be No Morning Star, that's just not a Stephen Sondheim lyric. That feels like purpley poetic, in a way that Sondheim was usually much more specific than that, and much more probing. So you can kind of see where Leonard Bernstein's contributions are still remaining in that score.
Interesting. That's fascinating, the process. I never even thought about how he might have come to end up writing those lyrics. That was a great question. That was not a stupid question at all.
Thank you.
Yes, Nicholas? You are also muted. There you go.
Hi, Michael.
Hi,
Hello.
Nick, by the way, was in our wonderful production of Passion that I'm so sorry most of you would not have gotten an opportunity to see.
and it's where I learned about Sondheim. It was a wonderful, for me, introduction because I hadn't done Sondheim. But you were speaking earlier about how Sondheim himself has said that there is no song without context, or there is no song without a scene. There has to be a scene.
Yeah.
And I wonder how in a musical, a dramatic like Passion, which you so masterfully directed, what it was like to work on a piece that was so fully sung through, almost an opera. Was it satisfying and was it challenging? And in what ways to work on a thing that was like an enormous 90-minute scene with music?
Yeah. I mean, so one of the unusual things about Passion is that it does not stop for applause anywhere until the lights go out at the end of the play. So in a traditional musical comedy or a musical theater in general, you get to the end of a song and the song finishes and the audience has an opportunity to express their appreciation through applause. When he and James Lapine were writing Passion, it was very clear to them that they did not want to give the audience that opportunity because, in fact, the act of applause is an emotional release. And they didn't want the audience to have the opportunity to have that release because it was, they saw the show as a long arc, exactly as you said, Nick, from the time the lights come up to the time the lights go out at the end. And so that was absolutely by design. For me, that is not a challenge at all. That is a tremendous joy because I love the integration of music and book. And one of the things that Sondheim does, he had said over and over, I still speak of him in the present tense, said over and over that he didn't know how to write a song until the book writer had written the scene. And what he would do is then steal from the book writer because he would learn what was happening, how the characters spoke, what the voice was. He would steal literal language. And of course, he would rewrite things tremendously. But it was true of virtually every project that he did, is that he and the book writer would sit down and talk. It's not like he wouldn't be involved at all, but they would talk about what it was going to be. The book writer, they would even talk about often where songs were going to appear in the show, but he would say, you write it first, and then I will steal from you. And so that is the way that he and James Lapine, who did work so seamlessly together, were able to create a work that felt like it was a single voice, even though the baton was being passed back and forth between a book writer and a lyric writer. And as a director and working on it, you know, I was obviously intellectually conscious of where we were in a song and where we were in a scene, but I never felt like I had to treat them any differently. It was a joy to be able to treat music and scenes in exactly the same way because they were telling the same story and with the same voice, and that seamless weaving in and out was a great joy.
Thank you. I got a glimmer of that in the brief time we had doing it together, and it was new in my experience and quite thrilling.
Yeah.
Chris,
I would say it's intellectual. I mean, sorry, it's technically challenging for an actor to need to be able to know when playing a scene where the downbeat is that you come in on the music and that kind of thing. So there are some of those kind of logistical challenges in weaving between music and dialogue in such a way, but they, for me, are not dramatic challenges. For me, that's just gold. Yeah.
Chris, go
Is
ahead.
there any way I can
Two questions.
raise my
One,
hand?
do you think
Wanna
you'll be
raise your hand
doing
again?
Passions eventually? Again, maybe at the Boston Court. But my first question was, at the beginning of your remarks, you talked about Hammerstein's influence on him and said something like it was interesting and it sort of raised questions. What do you remember that, and what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit. Sondheim spoke throughout his life about this, so it is repeated in many interviews and books and all sorts of things. But essentially, what happened was he came to Oscar with a show he had written, a school show that he had written that he was sure was going to be his ticket to Broadway. He brought it to Oscar Hammerstein and said, "Tell me what you think of this. I want to know the truth. You know, tell me what you think." And Oscar said, "It's the worst thing I've ever read." And it's not that it's untalented, but it's a mess, and here is why. And he began to go line by line, note by note, and tell him all the mistakes he made. And then he set him out on a course of action. And essentially it was to write 4 shows. And somebody who's read it more recently may know, but one of them was to be an adaptation of a non-theatrical work that he was going to adapt for the stage, like a novel or something. One, I think, was a play that he loved that he was going to adapt into a musical. One was a play that he thought didn't work, that he wanted to fix by making it a musical, and one was an original work. And he worked with him over many years in the development of those, which were all unproduced. They were all essentially, paper projects that Sondheim did during his period of training with Oscar. And then, of course, he continued to go to him while Oscar lived through the early stages of his career as he was doing things and ask his advice. And so he was the one who taught him how to structure things dramatically and how to how to tell story through lyrics and music and all of those things. So he credits Oscar with really being his great education in how musicals work.
That's amazing. Chris, did you have another question, or was that the?
Oh, she also asked about whether Passion will come back. I mean, I will say that I would love for it to come back. At this point, there aren't any immediate plans, and many of the challenges are, of course, financial. It's a big show, and we have all suffered through this challenge of COVID and everything. So, I don't know that it is dead yet. I certainly hope for an opportunity to bring it to a stage, because I do love it and was very proud of what we were making, but there aren't any immediate plans for it.
I think we have time for one last question, so go ahead.
Steve,
Go ahead.
Me? Am I on?
Yeah.
You mentioned that the first success that he had was a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. And it's sort of, I mean, I love the play and I think it's funny as heck, but I don't see the music as anything other than farcical and light and sort of silly.
Yeah.
And somehow I don't think of Sondheim, of all the things that he started out with. How in the world did he end up doing that?
Yeah, so I don't really remember the origin story about how he came to that project. Again, if somebody else knows that, feel free to chime in. But what I will tell you is that Sondheim, it became clear to Sondheim that the show is a farce, and it is a brilliant book and breakneck comedy funny. And what the songs were intended to be was a sort of respite from that. So, so he knew that his job was not to do something funnier than what the book was, but to give a little breathing room between all of that stuff. So while there are certain songs in it that are very clever and some clever lyrics and all that kind of thing, he wasn't attempting to compete with the comedy of that. And in fact, there's a famous story about the opening number, Comedy Tonight, was, I think, at least the third attempt that Sondheim made at writing an opening number for the show. They were performing it out of town. The show was bombing, and the consensus was that it was because they hadn't introduced the audience to the correct tone for the evening. And Jerome Robbins, who was brought in to gussy up the show, said, we need a baggy pants number here. You know, this is vaudeville, and you haven't taught us that. This opening number you've got for us now is sort of witty sophistication, and you need to tell us this is an evening of clowning. So write me a clown song. And he said, and don't give me any jokes. The jokes will all be visual jokes. Just give me a song where I can make the jokes through the physicality. So if you listen to that song, there are some clever lyrics in it, but none of them are big joke lyrics. It's all the setup for what was a huge raucous physical staging that included all kinds of very clever physical jokes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, Jessica, did you want to screen share the painting?
Oh yeah.
Sure, Michael, shall I? Would you?
Sure, of course, you're welcome to.
Okay.
So this is the painting that Michael had commissioned from his friend of Sondheim.
Travis Michael Holder, wonderful actor as well.
Yes, wonderful actor who some of you may have seen on Boston Court stages. So there's the quote, anything you do, let it come from you, then it will be new, give us more to see.
Great painting.
And you can sort of see in the upper left corner, there are these sort of ghostly figures that are the silhouettes of the figures from the George Seurat painting of.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's right. Look at them.
Yeah.
Oh, how cool.
Yeah.
Well, and on that note, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And thank you, Michael, so much for sharing your knowledge and your passion for Sondheim with us. This has been such a pleasure to get to hear about all these things that I didn't know about Sondheim. This is a very educational evening.
It was a treat. As I think is clear, he has been a huge influence on my life and career, and I always love talking about his artistry and all he has given to me and the world.
Well,
Happy
thank
birthday,
you. Thank you for doing it again tonight. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful rest of your night. And maybe we'll see some of you on Saturday at Josh's concert.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Good night. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the Zoom. Good night, everyone.